Hi, I'm Emma Smith from Hertford, and we're talking today. I'm talking with Shahnaz Ahsan about her recent novel. This is a series of recordings and stuff that the Development Office is putting out to keep in touch with the Hertford community while we're all so separate and so locked down. But this is just a fantastic opportunity for me to talk to Shahnaz about her new book. Hi, Shahnaz.
Hi, nice to be speaking with you.
It's brilliant to be speaking with you. Tell us, just start off. Tell us about your book. Give us the title. Tell us what it's about.
Yeah, of course. So Hashim Family is the title of my book. It's my debut novel. So it's been a long time in the making, but it finally came out on the 2nd of April this year. And it is the story of a family who moved from East Pakistan, which we now call Bangladesh, to Manchester in the 1960s. And that part of the storyline is very much inspired by my grandparents' experiences. And then it follows this family over a period of 20 years and their relationship between Britain and Bangladesh, and sort of the challenges that they face about sort of settling into one new place while still having ties to the place that they left behind.
Yeah, I absolutely loved that about the novel and the sort of parallels, I guess, between the different places, the two families, the ways. We don't want to give too much away because there's a kind of reveal in it. But what can you talk a bit about what the relationship is between Britain and Bangladesh in terms of your novel? How do you see the two? How do you or your characters see the two places?
I think each of the characters view each of the places in their own particular way, as we do as people. So there are four sort of main characters, I suppose, and the ones that we see who do the migrating, at least from East Pakistan to Manchester. There are two cousins who are called Hashim and Rafiqul, and Munira, who is married to Hashim. And each of these three, I think, have quite an interesting way of relating to different places. So you see some of them really sort of throwing their all into being English, and in some ways being more English than the English, because that's what they feel they have to do to be accepted. So you see instances of them, dabbling with changing their names, and the different ways that they react to that. And you also see that pull of home, which again, I think lots of migrants, it doesn't matter when you did it, lots of migrants and children of migrants, I think, still feel that sort of pull in different directions, I think.
And what about the politics of East Pakistan and the sort of birth of Bangladesh? Because that was one of the things that I thought was really fascinating about that. So one of your characters goes back as a war reporter, essentially, doesn't he? And then we've got this horrific depiction of war and what it's doing. Um, uh, how about? I mean, I suppose what was interesting about that to me is that you're not at all idealizing a kind of home country.
Mm.
What did you feel about that because those Bangladesh, there's bits about the war in East Pakistan are so horrific. They're much more horrific than anything that happens to the characters in Britain. But you've obviously kind of structured it so that that's that there isn't this kind of idyllic place back home. It's more
Yeah,
complicated than that.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that is, again, probably quite common to people who have migrated from a place that then undergoes some kind of turmoil. So whether that's, out and out war or some kind of natural disaster or something. And the guilt that people feel, I think, for having escaped whatever the trauma is back home, so to speak, and having that safety somewhere else.
Mm.
And as you say, what one of these characters does is he actually goes back to that environment and that place. And in a way, I think it's a kind of guilt that a lot of migrants feel. So when things are going really poorly, really badly back home, he wants to be there and be on the front line, almost as penance, I think. And the reason why I wanted to sort of explore the politics of the birth of Bangladesh is because it's, quite frankly, it's just something that I never was exposed to. in the mainstream. So like throughout my education in the UK, I was never taught about it in school. It never featured on any kind of documentaries or anything that I watched. So everything I knew came from the stories that my parents told me, or my grandparents. And I think it's just such an important and recent part of history. I mean, this only happened in 1971. And it's a way that you understand so much of migration history and patterns in the UK as well. It was basically one of the main reasons why I wanted to feature that in this particular book.
One of the things that struck me was there's a child born at the same time as the country, and I was thinking about your novel as a brilliant sort of love child in a way of classic Coronation Street on the one hand, and something like Midnight's Children on the other, the sense of a kind of a family or a domestic kind of story set against this extraordinary kind of political landscape. So you said that part of the inspiration for this was your grandparents' journey to the UK. What were your sort of more what were your more literary inspirations, or who do you draw on as a writer, do you think?
Yeah, well, when I was thinking sort of through the idea of this book, and it had been sort of knocking around in my head for years really before I actually sort of sat down and decided to write it, I'd always sort of thought of those books that explore a period of history through the lens of a family or people. And so it's very character driven, and this sort of stuff happens in the background. That's not to say it's not important, at some points I chose to foreground that, but it's all sort of told through the human experiences and the human face of it. And in terms of the writers, I love Louis de Bernier, and I think he's somebody who does that incredibly well, this idea of really getting into a place. So whether that's, wartime Greece, or, an island off the coast of Turkey during the, decline of the Ottoman Empire, just two of the periods that he wrote about, but it's all through that sort of very human interactions with people. But also, I think there is, I certainly felt that there was a shortage, as I said, sort of growing up, of those kinds of voices. I think now you've got more sort of writers talking about partition, and you've got different writers who talk about sort of the Bengali migrant experience. So like Jhumpa Lahiri is a writer that I really respect. And she talks very much about more recent migration from Bengal. So she also talks about India, Bengal going to America, but that's not my family's experience. So yeah, that was why I wanted to do this.
And tell me about one of the things that really struck me was the and family of the title of your novel, because in some ways, I guess what that conjures up, and there's something about the cover is a brilliant sort of mock-up of it painted on a sign, isn't it? And it is the sign of the shop. In some ways, that seems as if it might be quite a conservative idea, or quite a conservative idea. And in fact, the family that you talk about is an extraordinarily blended, extended, sort of non-traditional one in all kinds of ways. And in some ways, with these two really close women friends, Munira and Helen, at the heart of it. I thought that was a really interesting take on family, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, because a few people have sort of said that and sort of commented on how it seems very, as you said, non-traditional, like it's very unorthodox sort of family arrangement that we see in this book. But for early migrants, that was actually more common than we think. Sort of living in extended families, space was an issue. So sort of lots of people living together was quite common. And the friendships and connections that sort of came about, that you weren't just living together, you were also neighbours, you were friends, you were each other's guides and that kind of thing. And one particular story I remember was my grandmother telling me about when she first came to the UK. So she was living in one of these big extended houses full of, you know, other East Pakistani men. So she was the only woman in this house. And there was a little boy who was there, and he was with his dad. And I think he must have been in his early teens or something. But she and him were the only ones that were a bit different. They were the ones that weren't going off to work every day. And it's kind of unthinkable that, you know, a young bride would be sort of striking up a friendship with this sort of young lad, but they were all each other had. And I sort of took that as an inspiration for these sort of unorthodox or unexpected friendships that definitely happened in that period. And I think also we often think that, you know, a lot of the language, even now, about immigrants is that they keep themselves to themselves, they don't integrate with other people. You know, we hear language about ghettoization and that kind of thing. And actually people really did live alongside each other. These early sort of relationships of, you know, sort of interracial, you know, couplings really did happen, and they weren't all sort of frowned upon either. I think actually in a way that generation were a lot more pragmatic and in some ways more open-minded than they ended up being when they settled in the UK and had children.
That's so fascinating, because there's a scene that really strikes me. I don't want to give too much away about the book because I think it unfolds with a beautiful kind of rhythm, and I don't want to do a lot of spoilers, but I was just thinking there's a lovely bit I guess in the last third of the book where the younger generation, so the sort of second generation migrants, are talking that they're in clashes with the kind of National Front and those kind of fascist protesters in the 80s, and there's a conversation between them and two people from this older generation, Vincent, who's a sort of character slightly on the margins, who I liked very much, and Hashim, and the sort of the sense that the older generation, did you feel that they have had to they've had to compromise and to keep their heads down and get established, and in your book it seemed that it was the next generation who were able to be more angry, more sort of standing up against racism and more kind of out there, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that sort of comes naturally as well. But I think there is a difference from when you have moved to a place and when you've been born there. And I think, you know, when you've moved to a place, it takes time to work out the systems and how things are, and, you know, what the status quo is and how much you can push that. And I think a lot of people at that time, as you say, really did just want to keep their heads down and get on with it and weren't really looking for trouble. I think trouble often found them. And that comes through in the book as well, you know, sort of harassment and worse was certainly something that people felt right from the beginning. But yeah, the next generation, the ones that have been born in the UK, the ones that sort of feel like they've got some kind of claim onto this country, do expect more. And I think you see that even now, you know, like future generations, and all of that's completely legitimate, of course. You know, people have a long history with the UK before they've even come here, just by the virtue of the fact that they are from countries that were colonized. And so this sort of long history that migrants have with the UK before they've even become migrants, again, is something that I think isn't often talked about.
I thought that what was interesting about the migrant, well, not, I was going to say the migrant experience. I mean, obviously that's a really stupid kind of generalization, because there isn't one. There are you know, many thousands of different ones. But what the UK enabled for some of the people who came was quite double-edged, because on the one hand there are some kind of almost, they're not fairy tale, they're very kind of realistic, and I enjoyed the kind of realism of your book. But there are some really, you know, good news stories. Some things work out really well unexpectedly. that families are able to progress economically and sort of change their situations. Munira, who's a really interesting, ambitious, clever woman, with a husband who supports that kind of brilliantly. She's on her way, and she gets the things that she wants. She gets employment outside the home and the home business, and then she gets her, she's able to proceed. So on the one hand, there's all that kind of good stuff, and then on the other hand, there is this background of fear, and the people don't want to walk home on their own. There's a lot of protection of the young people, knowing that they're likely to be targets, and that's very that too is very sort of clearly and unflinchingly depicted. So I guess it is double-edged, isn't it? Their experience in your book. On the one hand, it gives a lot to them, and they work really hard for it, and on the other hand, it really treats them very, very badly.
Yeah, and I think that's the reality of what a lot of families experienced as well. I mean, in a way, for me, like as on one side of the family, I'm third generation. It's actually crazy to me to think that I have family members who have, lived in Bangladesh their whole life and have never dealt with their race and never been asked to, so their ethnicity has never really come up. It's never been noticed when they're in class. It's never been noticed when they're trying to apply for jobs or anything like that. And, maybe it was naivety or people just weren't aware of it or anything, but those early, people who were coming over, I just don't think had any kind of idea of what really to expect. And so that kind of, as you say, that sort of double-edgedness of it, it was an economic opportunity. And I think actually early on, and again, this comes through in the book as well, sort of Hashim says when he first comes over, the plan is just to come for 5 years and to do his work and to earn some money and to enough to set him up for when he goes back home. And then I think what often happens, and certainly what happens in this book, is that those advantages of being here, those perceived advantages, kind of take over. Fundamentally, there was a healthcare system that worked, there was an education system that worked. And those sort of very practical things, I think, especially when you have children, become enough to keep you, even though you yourself, as sort of that first generation who have come over and been displaced, that's what I think people mean when they talk about the sacrifice of people who come over. They're the ones that really do sort of give up their sense of belonging. I think it's actually really hard for us to really understand what that must have felt like to really give up your sense of legitimacy in a way, and to do that for the benefit of your children, or what you believe to be the benefit of your children. And then, as you say, that next generation come up and they have expectations that go beyond that. It's not enough for them to just have these, I don't know, educational opportunities, whatever. They're citizens, they belong, they deserve more than that. And I think that's a conversation you see happening throughout it as well.
I was struck that there is racism. There are racists. They're really faceless in the narrative. They're just a kind of presence. Someone's locking up the shop and they hear footsteps, or someone's in a playground just sort of shooting the breeze or something. And I wondered if you'd made a sort of ethical decision not to make racists into people, and not to write about them. So the white Brits that you talk about are all Helen, I guess, is an absolute, is part of the family.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that you say that, because I think on some level I must have made that decision, but I haven't heard it sort of, summed up as eloquently as you did just then. But yeah, I think often, racists or those kinds of individuals, whether it's, in the media or whether it's in a novel, become the subject. And I didn't want them to be the subject. And also I think it then becomes easier to say these are individuals and these are individual instances, and that particular person behaved like that, or that particular and you know, gang did this, but we're not all like that. And I actually think it's quite uncomfortable to admit, but I think that there are institutions and systems that were then and still are now racist and discriminatory.
Yeah.
And by talking about it as though it's sort of more generic, I think then means that we all need to be a bit more aware of our own complicit sort of, you know, part in this. Yeah.
Were you conscious as you were writing it? Did you ever feel you were censoring yourself or being making that complicity, that point about complicity, easier for readers? I tell you what I'm thinking of. There's a scene in the school classroom, which in some ways, I mean, there's awful violence in this book. I mean, very, very, very well depicted and not nothing gratuitous about it, but really, you know, really awful violence in both contexts, both national contexts. But the scene that I found unbearable in a way was the teacher in school.
Yeah.
And that seemed to be the moment when you were, I don't know, in some ways most explicitly kind of political, because nothing happens to her, does it? There's no redress, there's no one to speak to.
No.
There's nothing can be done. There's no sort of resolution to that story. She's just presumably still there. It was a really, really shocking kind of moment, really. And I just wondered whether you had more of those that you might have wanted to suppress, or how you felt about what I guess it's what your obligations are, whether you felt you had obligations in writing this novel and who you thought would be reading it.
It's really interesting that you say that, because that particular part, more than any of the rest of the book, was personal for me. So that was based on an actual classroom experience that I had in primary school. And I wonder if that sort of rawness of feeling maybe comes through, and that's what it is that you're responding to in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of, I guess, responsibility, or, you know, what it was that I wanted to pick, I suppose it's the different elements of it. I think, you know, these days, especially, people get really cross when you, you know, not accuse them of racism, but, you know, when you say that this is racist or whatever, you know, it's almost like it's more of an insult to be accused of racism than it is for you to actually do something that could be perceived as being racist. So the emphasis has shifted. It's like it's the worst thing you could possibly be called, even if what you're doing is that and does fall into that category, which I find crazy. But that sort of feels to be at the position that we're at. You know, we know that racism is a bad word and we don't want to be associated with it, and yet it still exists and pervades in so many different ways. And what that particular incident does, I think, is just sort of show the different ways it can exist. You know, we've got language for it now. We call it a microaggression. You know, so when, you know, somebody says something like, "Oh, you've written a book," you know, like in the way in which they say it, or, you know, like I actually had somebody tell me once at a dinner party I went to that I got this book published because it's trendy these days to be talking about that kind of stuff. You know, that kind of thing is what we call a microaggression. It's somebody saying, you know, your abilities alone are not enough, like you've got some other kind of advantage, people are doing you a favor, or something like that. And the way what that teacher does there, I mean, in some ways it's not really micro, like it's actually out and out aggression,
just
you know,
aggression.
Making this kid, you know, question, you know, their identity and their sense of belonging and their legitimacy. So yeah, racism isn't always, you know, somebody being beaten up. That happens in the book too. And it's not always, you know, National Front demos, although that happens in the book too. There's all of these different facets to it. And yeah, I didn't want to bang the drum too hard in writing the book, but in a way I didn't really have to, because actually when you talk about the lives of people, and if what you're doing is just telling the experiences of what a lot of people went through, then that's enough. You don't actually really have to make these points, because they sort of pop up naturally again and again, as they do in the course of real people's lives.
It's a really brilliant book. It's a really brilliant book, not just a brilliant first book. What are you writing now? What are you going to write? What's going to be the next one?
So the next one
too soon to say. You only just published this one.
No, it's not too soon. It's I have been working on something else. I was sort of told that the further you are into your next book at the time of publication, the better,
Yeah.
because you're focused on something else. But obviously, I think for everyone, this last month has been really sort of up and down for lots of people, and sort of being able to concentrate and that kind of thing has been difficult. And then obviously, the book only came out a month ago, so I've taken a few weeks off. But yes, I am partway into the next book. And again, that's also sort of focusing on a family, a South Asian family. But this one is actually set in a small town, which is very much based on the town that I grew up in. So it's an anonymous town in West Yorkshire at the moment. And it's this idea of children moving away and then coming back home. Yeah.
I'm really pleased to hear that. I'm not only, well, everything about that, but particularly to hear it set in West Yorkshire, which is our homeland for both of us.
Yes, it is.
Because I wondered why you didn't set this. Is that why you didn't set this in West Yorkshire, and why you set it in Lancashire instead? Is that because that's where your grandparents came to, or why was that the setting?
It was two reasons. So yeah, one is that is where my grandparents went to, and so the stories and things that I'd heard, for me, it just sort of, it happened that that's sort of where it popped up. And that's related to the second reason, which is that the very first chapter, when you see Hashim sort of standing on a train platform somewhere in Manchester, that first page that you read as a reader is the first page I ever wrote.
Right.
And it's basically unchanged from how I wrote it, and that's because it was the first scene that came into my head when I was thinking about this book. So Hashim just sort of turned up in my mind, and he happened to be in Manchester, and then after that point I didn't really feel like I could change it. So yeah, that's why. So yeah, I'm looking forward to writing about somewhere that I'm sort of a bit more personally familiar with, having grown up there. And I think it'll be nostalgic as well. I quite like writing about places when I'm not there, in a way.
Yeah.
I think you sort of remember places a bit more sharply, a bit more vividly when you're not actually physically there. So that's what I'm working on now.
So I'm just going to ask you a couple more things. One is, as a writer, you're going to be better at working from home probably than the rest of us. So you've probably already got some tips about
Yeah.
how to manage that a bit better. So I'm going to ask you for any of those. And then I just thought maybe we'd finish up with just a quick, if you could do a whistle-stop tour between Hertford and now for you. I think people would really love to know, how you got from A to B, or H to A, or whatever the initials will be. So firstly, what's your have you got any killer tips for those of us trying to concentrate?
Yeah,
when you can always get up and make a cup of tea and
yeah. So I always try and start the day with doing something that is productive, but not necessarily productive in terms of work. And by that I mean something as menial as putting a load of laundry in, or making sure that you make your bed, or something like that. Just something that is practical and tangible, and you feel like you've already done it. And I think something that sort of does your future self a favour is always really nice. So I actually quite often will be doing laundry, or making sure that I've got something at the freezer to defrost for doing something later, like sort of a very basic chore, but it actually feels like there's something you can mentally tick off your list.
Yeah.
I do. And I think having a set place to work is really helpful. And you don't do anything else in that space. And I know that not all of us, are able to have the luxury of moving around. We don't always have that much space. But I think even just something as simple as, if you find it difficult to work in your bedroom, try and make an effort to work at your kitchen table, or mix it up throughout the day or something. But I think your environment really does matter. So yeah, they would be my top 2 tips.
That's really great. And then just give us the potted version. So you did history and English. When did you graduate?
So I graduated in 2009, and then after that I went to Bradford, so back home for a year, and I did a master's at the University of Bradford at the Peace Studies department there. which I absolutely loved. And it was very different to doing history in English, but it was, you know, studying alongside people who were like working in development and that kind of thing. And for a while I actually thought that I might go down that line. But in the end I got a job in London. And I always said that I wouldn't contribute to the brain drain. Like, I was really, really adamant that I would stay in West Yorkshire, but ultimately a job came up in London that I really loved the look of, which was working in interface in a non-profit. So I moved down to London and basically spent the next 8 years working in various different non-profits and higher education. And then I did a master's in the US. I was lucky enough to get a scholarship. And went to UPenn, University of Pennsylvania, and did a master's in nonprofit leadership. And it was actually then that I started writing Hashim Family. So then when I came back to the UK, I sort of decided to prioritise writing. So I carried on working in higher education part-time, and then writing part-time as well. Where does that take us up to? Then I did a very Hertford thing and got married to somebody who I'd met at Hertford. And yeah,
Give
then
him
we
a
moved.
shout out. Is he allowed to?
Yeah. Give him a shout out. Yeah. And then we moved to Ethiopia last year for his work. So we moved to Addis Ababa almost 2 years ago now, actually. So I've been living in Ethiopia for the last 2 years. So yeah, you asked for a whistle-stop tour. I think that's taken you to a couple of continents even.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So Shahnaz, we should wrap it up. It's been so really great to talk to you. Really, really great. I absolutely loved the book, and one of the ways I loved it is I've been thinking about the characters since, and sort of kind of wondering what they're doing. It's a feeling I have when I read someone like Anne Tyler, who I think is a really brilliant chronicler of a kind of ordinary but kind of extraordinary kind of interrelationships and stuff, and I'm thinking afterwards, what are those characters doing? And I thought that about Hashim Family. I think it's a really, really brilliant novel. So let's give that a shout out to everybody who is listening. Hashim Family by Shahnaz Ahsan came out in last month. You can hear Shahnaz talk about it on BBC Radio 4's Front Row on the 14th of April. That's on BBC Sounds. So if you want to hear a proper interviewer talking to her, I'd go there. But I just wanted to say thanks, Shahnaz, and congratulations.
Thank you so much.
I really am so looking forward to the next one in the unnamed place, which we all know is Keighley.
Yeah, we might as well give that one a proper shout out.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, thank you. It's been so good talking to you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Shahnaz. Thanks.
Bye.